Good morning again, everyone. My name is James Berry. I'm faculty here at Bushnell University, and Lars has given me the sad task of ending all your wonderful conversations, but the good task of introducing or reintroducing our speaker for today, Matt Holmes. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here. Whenever I've gotten a chance several times now to talk about the church and politics, and I always want to start by saying thank you because you showed up to a conversation about Christianity and politics, and that's always a gamble, right? Unless you've heard the person before, you're never quite sure what they're going to say. And so I appreciate you taking the gamble of being here and listening to me talk about this. And I want to start by explaining to you why I in particular am up here. So I actually, starting in high school, I appreciated hearing from the communications professor because debate was my jam in high school. That was my club. That was what I was a part of, and I debated political philosophy. And that got me really interested in political philosophy, so that's what I studied in college. And I was an intern with the Washington State Legislature as a junior, and then I worked as a lobbyist as a senior. And through an experience that I don't need to get into now, but had to do with the fact that I was lobbying for a public institution the year of the Great Recession, I found myself really discouraged by politics and the tools that politics had to solve the problems of the world. And I went home to my 50-person church plant that I was a part of, and I thought to myself, I see more hope in what's happening in this room with these people than what happened in all those rooms over there with all of those people. And so that caused me to transition over into pursuing ministry. Eventually, I took the Jonah path to ministry, but eventually God got me there. And I came into ministry as a person with an extensive background in political theory. And I started looking at the resources that were available for pastors to help them navigate political situations. And what I found was that at least the materials available for pastors and church leaders and Christians, it tended to be based on a lot of Bible and a high school civics course. It didn't tend to engage very much with political theory, and it definitely didn't really engage with the assumptions that we make as a culture about why we have governments and what they're for and the role they're supposed to play. They kind of took for granted everything that they learned in high school civics and put the Bible on top of it. And I have found that that is a major problem for us as Christians as we try to build a biblical worldview, a biblical political worldview, is that we don't actually start with the Bible. And it's not on purpose. It's just there's a story, a parable about these two fish. The young fish are swimming along, and they pass this old fish, and the old fish says, "Hey, boys, how's the water?" And the young fish swim along, and then after a while, one of them turns to the other and says, "What's water?" Because we just don't recognize the water that we're swimming in. And as Americans, that is Western political philosophy assumptions. It's called Western liberalism, but it's big L, not like small l. And we don't recognize that. And so we just draw those assumptions into the Bible. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start by identifying those assumptions that we bring in. And then I'm going to turn to the Bible, and I'm going to look at the story that the Bible tells. And we're going to compare them, and we're going to see how they're different in a very important way. And so we're going to look at the political vision that the Bible casts, and then we're going to, at the end, talk about what that means for us as Christians and as church members and as church leaders, congregation members and congregation leaders. I told you I was going to use the word congregation. And apply that in the world in terms of especially what Dr. Beck was talking about yesterday in terms of being a sacramental witness. What actually is it that we are witnessing to? And I'm going to argue that we're witnessing to a fundamentally different political assumption, a political worldview. Yeah, so political theory are the assumptions that we all as Americans, no matter where you're at, we basically all share that. And then we argue about how to apply it. But our political assumption, well, and actually I'm going to start there. That's right where I'm going to start. So let me begin with one of the most influential theological documents in America. I'm going to begin with a reading from the Gospel according to Thomas Jefferson. Actually, I just realized he published a gospel. That was a joke. Okay, the first epistle of Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, Donald Trump got a lot of grief for publishing a Bible that had the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in it, and I would say that it's a little unfair since most of us, whether we intend to or not, tend to read the Bible with the Declaration of Independence in the front, because most of us think that that's accurate. Most of us would probably say, yes, God made everybody equal, and he gave them equal rights, and he instituted governments to protect those rights. And we'll even read that into Romans 13. That's why God instituted authorities for the good of everyone. And that's what Jesus means when he says, render unto Caesar's that which is Caesar's. The government has this divinely instituted role to protect the rights that God gave us. We think that all that's in the Bible. And the truth is that none of it is in the Bible. The only part of that is accurate is that we hold those truths to be self-evident. They're not, and they're also not biblically accurate. And so those are the assumptions that we start with that I want to then compare to the biblical story, because the biblical story is very different. See, the problem is we tend, like I said, to jump, when we want to talk about a Christian political worldview, we want to jump to the passages that seem to be obviously about politics. So we jump to Romans 13, and we jump to Matthew 22 is the Caesar thing. And the problem is that so much has changed in our political worldview since those things were written and said, that it's kind of like using those as a basis for our politics, our political engagement today, uncritically, is like using biblical passages about chariots to teach automotive repair. They are too different. You have to do a ton of translation. So if we're going to understand what the Bible says about politics, we have to build it on the biblical story about politics. And the Bible does not begin by saying that God created people equal. It says that he created us in his own image. Now, being created in the image of God is absolutely a statement of value, of immense value. It is not a statement about equality. Now, why doesn't the Bible say that God made us equal? Well, I would argue that it is not because we aren't equal, but because equality in a biblical perspective is irrelevant. And here's what I mean. Equality is an immediately comparative term. It doesn't actually tell you whether you're worth much or a little. It doesn't tell you whether you're a $100 bill or a penny. It just tells you that you're worth the same amount as everybody else. And what you immediately do when you talk about equality is you look at what you have, and then you look at what they have. And you look at what they have. If you have kids, every time you cut up dessert, what are they going to look at? How big is my purse versus everybody else's pieces? And so when Thomas Jefferson said, we are all created equal, and that governments are instituted to protect that equality, he is basing that on an assumption that there is a limited pie, and if we don't divide it outright, we're not all going to get what we are entitled to. And so we need to start by focusing on what we're entitled to and getting our portion. The reason why that's relevant is because he's assuming scarcity. He's assuming that there isn't enough. If you read the people that Thomas Jefferson read and plagiarized to write the Declaration of Independence, they dig into that more about the assumption there's not enough to go around. Thomas Hobbes says we're equal, and that's a problem because that means we're equals fighting over limited resources, and we have no way to solve the problem, so the government has to sort it out for us. So there's that assumption of scarcity. But the Bible doesn't talk about equality because the Bible does not assume scarcity. Look what happens, what is said immediately after God creates us in his image. It says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. I give to you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. Walter Brueggemann calls it a liturgy of abundance, Genesis 1. The world that God made is good, full of plenty, whether Adam and Eve are equal doesn't matter because they're not in competition for anything. There's always enough for both of them. So it's not to say that their equality is wrong, but that in the biblical mindset, it doesn't come up. It doesn't need to. Now, we say, how do we make sense of the fact that there's a world of abundance, but we experience scarcity? There are legitimate reasons to be anxious. There are legitimate reasons to care about how we distribute things to people, right? Injustice is real. But how can we account for injustice in a world of abundance? That's why I have toilet paper. Because this is a perfect example for those of us who lived through 2020. Everybody remember when you couldn't get this? Remember the shelves being empty and pictures of people with just carts overflowing with toilet paper. Now, why was there a shortage of toilet paper? Why did we have to ration toilet paper? People that investigated this after it died down, and what they said was there was no scarcity. Toilet paper was one of the most reliable supply chains we had during the pandemic, because it was all made domestically. It was made with very abundant resources, trees and water. We did not have any problem getting trees and water during COVID. And the plants that made it were all in rural areas where COVID numbers were very low. So there was no scarcity. There was anxiety. Somebody got it into their head that there wouldn't be enough, and so they started panic buying. And someone else saw that, and because they saw someone panic buying, they wanted to make sure that they got their cut before everybody else panic buyed, so they panic bought. And all of a sudden, it became this epidemic of anxiety and scarcity, and then we had actual scarcity. Even though there was plenty, there was enough to go around, but we created the scarcity. And the interesting thing is that when you look at the story of Scripture, that is what happens to humanity. Anybody know who built the first city in the Bible? Cain, the first murderer, built the first city. So in Genesis 4, God tells Cain, because you've murdered your brother, you're going to have to be a restless wanderer. And Cain says, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. And he goes off, and God sends him to wander, and what does he do? Cain built a city and named after his son Enoch. Instead of wandering, he builds a city. And you can tell by the career of that city throughout the rest of the chapter that it is founded on this anxious need to protect yourself, because it climaxes with this guy named Lamech, who has this poem that's all about how he will rain down destruction on someone else at the slightest provocation. So Cain built the first city to address his basic anxiety of being killed. But here's the interesting thing. What does God say to him when he expresses his fear? He says, whoever finds me will kill me. And the Lord said to him, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. The mark of Cain was not a curse. It was a mark of protection. Cain had a divine promise that he would not be killed, and he still built a city to protect himself. And that city, founded on that anxiety, became the culture that needed to be destroyed by the flood. Who built the second city in the biblical narrative? What was the second city? Babel, or actually Babylon. It's the same word in Hebrew. So it's the founding of Babylon. Why did they build the second city? Well, it says that they built the city so that they could make a name for themselves, which is neurotic anxiety, making a name for themselves, and so they won't be scattered over the face of the whole earth. It was to protect themselves because they wanted to concentrate power in one place. What was the last thing God said to humanity before they built the Tower of Babel? God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the sky. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. See, we didn't lose abundance at the fall. We didn't lose abundance at the flood. In fact, if anything, there's more to go around because Noah and his descendants are allowed to eat animals. So there's still abundance in the world, but there's also still anxiety. Now, I don't have time to go into it, but if you read The Slavery of Death, you'll see the argument that what changed is our mortality. When we became mortal, we became obsessed with staying alive, and that causes us to be anxious. And that's what's different about Cain. That's why Cain cares that his brother gets more credit for his sacrifice than Cain does, because he's in competition with his brother. And that's what changes humanity. But throughout the story of Genesis, God is looking for people to trust in his abundance. And the first person who really trusts in his abundance, imperfectly, but really does, is Abraham. Because God calls Abraham and says, I want you to leave the place where you live, and I want you to go to this other place where you don't live, and I want you to be a nomad, and I want you to trust that I'm going to provide for you, and trust an even bigger thing, that I'm going to make you and your barren wife the parents of a whole nation. That's trusting in God's providence. And notice what God says to them, how he describes this to them, is that I will make you a great nation, this is Genesis 12, and I will bless you. That blessing is the word that's used when God declares abundance to humanity in Genesis 1 and to Noah and his family in Genesis 9. And he says to Abraham, you are going to be the means of the blessing to the whole world. Now, I don't think that means that God is going to directly bless them through Abraham, because the thing is, the blessing never left. He's going to prove to them through Abraham and his family that the blessing is there and can be trusted. Because remember, that's the problem. The problem is not the supply chain. The problem is not how much toilet paper it is. The problem is the panic buying. The problem is the selfishness, the fact that we are obsessed with making sure that I get my cut of the toilet paper. And so what God is doing through Abraham and then through Israel is demonstrating to the world my abundance, my providence, my generosity can be trusted. And that, I'm going to argue, is a major point of what the law of Moses is all about. Because here's the thing. We talk about the law of Moses as a moral code, as a religious code, but we very rarely talk about it as a law. And so one of the first things that I did in my journey of putting all of this together and trying to discern what is the political vision of the Bible is looking at what kind of society does the law of Moses create if you actually apply it as a law. There have been people wanting to practice the politics of the Bible for a long time. Nobody, even the Israelites, have ever actually really tried to just live out the law of Moses. Because here's what the law of Moses does. The first thing it does is it hamstrings all of your focuses of power that you use to control things. Every sense of control. Because in the law of Moses, there's no central government. Now, they were allowed to ask for a king later, but the original design is there's no central government. There's no capital city. There's no standing army. They are forbidden to stockpile military technology. They are forbidden to form military alliances with pagan nations. And when they do go into battle, they call out the militia. The first thing they do is a reverse draft. The captains go out and they say to everybody, hey, anybody just get married? Okay, go home. Anybody plant a field that you haven't harvested yet? Okay, go home. And the last one is anybody afraid? Go home. Like that thing that Gideon did to whittle down, that God did through Gideon to whittle down the army, they were supposed to do that every single time. And the whole point is, you're not going to win this with your military power. If you win, it's because God did it. So basically, he hamstrings them to the point that if they are able to maintain their independence, it is only because God is on their side. It is only because of God's generosity. And that's what we see happen through Judges. I mean, they're disobedient, so they barely hold on to their independence, but it's only because when God steps in. Now, the second thing that the law of Moses does is it hamstrings them economically through the Sabbath. So the Sabbath requires them to take one day off every week. Now, we have found a way to turn Sabbath, big deal, we take 2 days off, but we use those 2 days to make more money because we don't all take the same days. I worked in retail for a long time. I worked people's Sabbaths so they could spend money on their weekends. Real Sabbath cannot be practiced individually. Real Sabbath means you shut down your entire economy. In fact, the command in the Ten Commandments is for the head of the household to give everyone the day off, including the animals. Like it is a cultural, social thing. The whole community shuts down for a day. Nobody does anything. And if you're actually going to practice Sabbath, you also have to do that 1 year out of every 7. And that's where it really hamstrings them, because your society does not survive without farming for a year unless something really weird happens in nature. Like, they're supposed to trust that the fields will just naturally produce enough food for them to eat. And they're not allowed to harvest. You're only allowed to go out and gather what you can that day. And then then they have to do this again once every 50 years. They have another year off. So they 2 years in a row of no farming, no economy, just everything shuts down. And so if they're also then required to periodically cancel debts and release slaves and redistribute the land to the original owners, which means that they can't accumulate generational wealth. So all the things that we use economically to protect ourselves, they cannot do. So they are hamstrung, meaning they are then dependent on God's grace. If they are able to feed themselves for more than 6 years at a time, it's because God showed up. So right off the bat, what they are doing is they are demonstrating the reality of God's abundance. But then the law of Moses also requires them to act out God's abundance. Because here's the thing. I think we assume, one of the most dangerous assumptions we make is that everybody knows what we talk about when we use the word justice. There's a scholarly article that started with the point, nobody actually knows what justice means. It's because justice, it's a container word. When we talk about justice, we always mean something else, because justice really just means people getting what they should get. But we don't agree, it doesn't tell you what people should get. And we don't all agree on what people should get. The basic agreement that we have is that everybody should get the same. But we don't agree on whether they should get the same result or the same opportunity or like the same what. But we do say we're equal, we should get the same. Ancient cultures would have said, no, you should get what your station deserves. Justice means the people who deserve, who are elite get more and the people who are poor get less, because that's what they should get by nature, that kind of thing. But when we talk about what people should get, that's always based on our assumption about how much there is. And when we say that justice is based on equality, we're assuming that there may not be enough to go around. And so we need to ensure that everybody gets the same amount. In the Bible, the assumption is abundance. And that means that all of a sudden the definition of justice is not based on equality, it's based on compassion, which is the way we treat resources that are infinite. What is the basic thing you do when somebody's hurt, at least in a movie? You give them air. Why? Because there's so much air. We can give anybody air anytime. It's free as air, right? We don't begrudge anybody air. And that's what we're supposed to do with God's resources. Because if you look in the law of Moses, they are required to give everyone a break, right? The employer is required by law to give everybody, including the animals, a break. And the Sabbath year gives the land a break. They are required to leave parts of their fields unmown so that people can glean. They are required to forgive debts. They are required to release slaves. They are required to return land. They are required by law to love their neighbors and to love foreigners. Those aren't moral commands. Those are laws. They're required to be compassionate. And that's why I say there are no rights in the law of Moses, because there don't need to be, because it is on the obligation of every recipient of God's generosity to be a generous person. So you shouldn't even need to talk about equality or what people are worth, because you're innately supposed to be generous. That's why in Deuteronomy 15 it says there will be no poor among you. But then it says, if anyone is poor among you, give to them without begrudging. Don't be half-hearted or tight-fisted. Rather be open-handed and freely lend to them. Otherwise, they may appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin if you are not generous with the poor. So he says there won't be poor. Why? Because when you encounter the poor, you're supposed to be generous to them. Not because of some obligation about what each person is entitled to, but because God is generous, and therefore we can and must be generous. So that is the vision that the law of Moses casts. The problem is that the Israelites are terrible at fulfilling it. Because after struggling with the cycles of the judges, they finally get tired of depending on God to get them out of problems. And they say, all right, you said we could have a king. Yeah, we want a king now. We want a king to fight our battles. The problem isn't that they wanted a king. God said they could have a king. The reason they wanted a king was because they didn't want to have to trust in God's abundance. They wanted to have control. And so the kings came in, and if you look at the career of the kings, each king takes the next step in centralizing power. Saul starts by rejecting Yahweh, the rules of warfare that show that God is in control. If you look at the things that get him in trouble, he does not like having to fight in a way that depends on God. He wants to take control. Then David becomes king, and he creates his own army, a capital. He takes control of the state religion, of the Israelite religion. He takes control of the priesthood. He centralizes everything in Jerusalem. And then Solomon actually abolishes the tribal structure and sets up a bureaucracy. All of those marriages that he gets into, those aren't actually motivated by lust. The word for love there is a political relationship. Those wives are ambassadors. And they bring their gods with them as part of that relationship. So he brings idolatry into the nation for the sake of political alliances to prop up the state. And in the ultimate sacrilege, he then enslaves the Israelites. He becomes Pharaoh. And from then on, the kings lead Israel and Judah further and further down this path of making decisions based on anxiously controlling resources and anxiously defending their thrones by alliances and changing religions and breaking the covenant because they're afraid of losing what they've been given, and they are incapable of just trusting that God is enough. And ultimately, instead of receiving the blessing of God, they receive the curse of God because God is making a point with Israel. And finally, he concludes, I wanted to be able to point to Israel and say, this is what I meant. This is how you can live in my abundance. And instead, I had to give you the curse to show you whatever I meant, this is not it. And the Old Testament ends with that mission of displaying God's abundance unfulfilled. And then Jesus steps onto the stage. And Jesus starts preaching this message that is littered with political terms. We don't see it because we are focused in on the world's political view, and we say, well, Jesus isn't political. He doesn't talk about how to control resources. He's very political. Kingdom of heaven was a Jewish political term. I mean, it's kingdom. It's reign, right? But also words like gospel, repent, believe, or faith, Lord, Savior, those are all terms that Caesar's used. Those are all political terms. Faith is allegiance. Repent means switching sides. Good news is how you announce a political victory. Even Son of Man, Jesus' favorite title for himself, is a reference to the one who inherits the kingdom of heaven in Daniel 7. And Jesus comes and preaches this message where he says, I have come to fulfill the law. I take that to mean, because you don't normally fulfill a law. You keep the law or you break the law. But he's fulfilling the trajectory of the law. He is fulfilling what the law was meant to create. Because you'll notice he then goes on to list all these laws. And you've heard these laws. Well, here's what you're actually supposed to do. And it's always in a trajectory, right? And so look at the theme. The Sermon on the Mount is the best place to see this. Look at the theme of what Jesus is saying. People talk about Jesus being a great moral teacher. Jesus is not a great moral teacher unless his theology is accurate. Because when he tells you to do something, he tells you to do it because God will pay the bill. Look at the Beatitudes. Why are the poor in spirit blessed, right? Remember the blessing word? Why are they blessed? Because they'll receive the kingdom of heaven. Why are those who mourn blessed? Because they will be comforted. By who? By God. Why are the meek blessed who never win anything? Because they will inherit the earth from God. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness are blessed because they will be filled by God. The merciful will be shown mercy by God. The pure in heart will see God. The peacemakers will be called children of God. Like if you look through that makes no sense to say those kinds of people are blessed unless God sets it right, unless you trust in God's abundance. When he says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Why? Because God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Because God is not anxious as he bestows the blessings of the world. He doesn't only give them on the people he likes because he doesn't need to withhold anything. He's not worried about what will happen if he gives rain to everyone. God is generous. And in fact, he finishes that point by saying, be perfect as your Father is perfect, or be complete. We're supposed to reflect God's completeness as opposed to withholding out of anxiety of what will happen if I let someone who's my enemy benefit from something. The longer I live as an adult, the more I understand that what Jesus says about worrying is not just some little mental health, like here's how to feel a little bit better about your life, but it is the core to us being able to live good and moral lives. He says, do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we wear? For the pagans run after these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Notice, the reason not to be anxious is because of God's providence, God's intervention, what God will do. Jesus' moral teaching makes no sense. It's not accurate unless you trust in God's providence. And perhaps the best place where you can see how Jesus is different is in the golden rule. Did you know that Jesus was not the first one to say the golden rule? We actually have the golden rule in some various formulations in Egypt about 2,000 years before Jesus. In India, perhaps as far back as 400 years before that. In Greece, about 600 years. In Persia, as far back as 300 years. Jesus was not the first one to say it, but Jesus introduced it differently. Because you know what the first word of the golden rule is? Therefore. The golden rule is a conclusion. And how does it start? Technically, I'm using the NIV and they don't use therefore, but it's there. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be opened. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, who are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So, therefore, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. Lots of people said the golden rule because it makes logical sense, but we don't do it. What Jesus tells us is that we can do it because God provides. And it is the provision of God that makes it possible for us to actually follow through on what we can all agree is a pretty logical, reasonable way to treat other people. But our anxiety keeps us from actually doing it. And so the message that Jesus preaches is based on basically saying that we need to be the community that God has been calling us to be all along, a community that trusts in the supply chain, that recognizes the problem is the anxiety. The problem is the lack of trust. We need to be a people of faith. And in order for people to learn that, it needs to be proven to them. And Israel failed to prove it. So where was it finally proven to us? At the cross. There's this confrontation between the greatest power of death and anxiety in the world at the time, the Roman Empire and Jesus. And the representative of the Roman Empire says, so you're a king, huh? You're a competitor with me. You're a rebel. And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place. You are a king then, said Pilate. And Jesus answered, you say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came in the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. I want to unpack three things about that. Number one, Jesus does not say his kingdom is not in this world. He says it's not from this world. It is not a worldly kingdom. It exists on a different basis. And what is the difference? His disciples didn't fight to protect him. The difference, the easiest way for Pilate, this military commander, to see the difference is the fact that Jesus did not lead an armed rebellion. And that's why when he says, so you are a king, he says, well, you say I'm a king because you're trying to provoke a fight. But I'm not here to fight. I am here to testify to the truth. Because in a way, at least in terms, we're just talking about politics. The crucifixion means everything, right? We can spend years talking about everything that's happening in the crucifixion, everything it means. But politically, it doesn't change anything. It proves a reality that was always true, which is that God's grace and abundance is more powerful than anything. Because do you know in political philosophy how we define a state? One of the common definitions of a state is an association that has a monopoly on violence. Basically, the group that can kill you and it's not murder, they're the government. If the Shriners kill you, it's murder. If the mafia kills you, it's murder. If the state kills you, it's an execution. That's what makes the state. Okay? And that's their ultimate card to play is death. And they played it on Jesus. Because Jesus' message, even though it doesn't seem to us to be political, it is intensely political because he is undercutting the anxiety that fuels the power of the state, both the Roman state and the Jewish state, the Jewish temple complex. When people aren't afraid, they don't think they need the army. When people don't think that they need human power to control the resources, they are less willing to go along with things that they know are wrong. They're less willing to serve the agenda of another person. And that's the threat that Jesus' message, the political threat that it causes. And so they need to crush this message. And they try. And God overrules them. Because they kill him, and God brings him back to life. And what that proves to us is that God's grace is more powerful even than death. Because ultimately, death is the evidence against God's abundance, right? We really might actually starve to death. People starve to death in this world. But death is not the end. Death is not the ultimate reality. And God's grace transcends death so that Jesus could do what the Israelites could not. The Israelites, they would abandon God's generosity at the slightest provocation. Jesus stays true to the point of being killed for it. And even then, when he pays that ultimate price, God's generosity still wins. That's why Paul can say that God disarmed the powers at the cross, because there's nothing left for them to do. They have no more cards to play. Their whole claim over us, their whole logic of why we need them is disproven at the cross. And the proof of that is in the community that develops out of the cross and out of the empty tomb. Because here's the amazing thing that you see at the end of the narrative of the Bible, the historical narrative of the Bible, is you see this community in Jerusalem. And Luke describes it in a very meaningful way. If you've been tracking with the political vision of the Bible and what the law of Moses was meant to do. It says in Acts 4, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace's generosity, was so powerfully at work in them that that there were no needy persons among them. From time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. Now, you may have heard people argue that the early church was communist. And it's not true, because communism is a scarcity mindset. Communism is a way of distributing goods fairly, right? It's presented as a philosophy of how we distribute goods fairly, forcibly, to make sure everyone has enough. Nobody forces anybody to do anything in the early church. In fact, there's a whole weird story where somebody dies for lying about it, and before they die, Peter makes the point, no one made you sell your land, and so there was no reason for you to lie about how much money you gave us, because there's no force involved here. There's compassion. Because this community that is united around trust in the resurrection of Jesus and the way that fundamentally changes our reality, they don't have a scarcity mindset. They are willing, oh, you have a need? I've got a field. Perfect. I'll sell my field and I'll meet your need. They're not afraid, because for us, what our flesh does is, wait, but I might need that field. I might need that later. So I'm going to hold on to it in the off chance that I might need it, rather than give it to you for your real need. What you see here is a community that judges justice based on compassion, which is how we handle justice if we don't have a scarcity mindset. And so the trajectory that the story is on as the historical narrative ends is of this community that is fulfilling God's political vision, expanding out into the Mediterranean and thereby out into the world. And it is the church, the congregation, not the institution, but these concrete communities and the way they treat each other and the way they live together that fulfills what God called Adam and Eve and Abraham and Moses and his people to do in the world. They live out the abundance and the grace of God. And that's what we're meant to be a part of. That's the story that we are joining. And so when we participate in our culture, I have about 5 minutes, I think. Here's my applications for us of what this means for us to live and participate faithfully in this world, being part of this story. The first thing is our congregational leaders, our congregations can and we must cultivate trust in God's abundance and grace, because nobody else can do that. The only reason we have to think that there is abundance and not scarcity is if there is a God of love and grace at the foundation of it. If the gospel isn't true, then scarcity is. And the best we can do is scrabble for the bits that we can get in this life. In the church, in the congregation, we can cast for people a vision of God's generosity. And if you look to the New Testament, unfortunately, I didn't have time. I have a lot more to talk about, like with the kings, and also I haven't gotten to get into the letters. And the letters are full of this. When you go to the epistles, you'll find that they are very political in the biblical sense. I'm preaching through Ephesians right now, and it's politics from the beginning to end because it's about being a community of God's grace. And Paul especially loves to spend time helping people have a vision of God's generosity and grace. That's what Romans 8 is about. That's what his prayers in Ephesians are about, when he prays that we would know the depth of God's love and trust in the power that is at work within us, because it helps us to be a different kind of people. So as congregations, we need to intentionally cultivate that trust in God's generosity. Number two is because we need to do that because, first of all, only trust in God's grace allows us to engage faithfully rather than anxiously. Because I'm not saying that we should say, hey, Jesus has the wheel, God's generous, I'm just going to step back and everything will be fine. I'm not talking about disengagement. The whole point, though, is we need to recognize that the problem is not the resources, it is anxious engagement. That is the problem in this world, is human beings' anxious engagement. And the way to set it right is non-anxious engagement. See, we did need to step in and ration the toilet paper, right? But it wasn't the rationing that ended the scarcity. It was when people finally realized that there was enough to go around and they stopped panic buying. And now we have a more just distribution of toilet paper, because if you have an extra need for toilet paper, no one's going to begrudge it to you. Go in and buy it. I'm not going to make sure that you don't buy more than I got, because if you have a special need for toilet paper, please have seriously, if anybody needs this, I don't need to take it home with me. You can have it, right? So for instance, my oldest child just started kindergarten. I am now officially a parent in the public school system. And that is a whole new reason to be anxious, and a whole new reason to be anxious about the way politics are going, because it's connected. Whether you're happy with where the schools are at or you're unhappy, I now have this reason to be anxious, right? And I have two choices, and parents make both of these choices. I can go in there guns blazing and say, I know what you're going to do with my kids, and I'm not going to let you and I'm going to let it happen. And I come in there with my fists up and my anxiety flaring, and people do this. And I am not going to have a good effect on that classroom. I don't know what's going to happen, but I can guarantee you I won't get what I want. And it won't make it better. But that doesn't mean I go, oh, God's got it. I don't need to care what's going on in the public schools. I don't need to care about what my kids are being taught or anything or that. What it means is I can go into that classroom and I can meet the teacher and I can engage out of compassion, be motivated by love for my son, and love for his classmates, and love for that teacher, and love for that school, and love for that community, and want to make it better. And if that's where I come from, I am going to do better there than I ever would out of anxiety. Doesn't mean I'm going to get what I want. It doesn't mean that it's going to go the way I want it to necessarily, but it will always be better than going in guns blazing, fists up, trying to anxiously control things. And too often, as Christians, we go in that way. And the problem is, when we go in that way, we undercut our testimony. Because what happens if you go around telling everybody, hey, there's enough toilet paper to go around, and then you start filling your cart with as much toilet paper as you can get? Are you going to help people feel less anxious, or are they going to feel more anxious? They're actually thinking you're trying to pull the wool over their eyes so you can get more of it. We have to engage faithfully in a sense of having trust in God's generosity, because that's what's actually going to make the difference. Right? Number 3, faith in God's grace allows us to go beyond equality to the true justice of compassion. I think that sometimes the church, the temptation is to draw that straight line from the biblical call for justice to modern justice movements and say, well, we'll just take that and put it in. And that can sometimes get us into trouble. And ultimately, it gets us into trouble because I don't believe that the equality narrative or conversation will fully realize justice. And here's the reason. Because then we all start talking about, well, what's my share? Because we want to make sure we have equal shares. And when we add up all the shares that we claim, it's always more than 100% of the pie. So then we have to start talking about who's going to lose some pie. And as soon as we start talking about, oh, this group needs equality, this group needs more, what other people hear is, okay, you're going to take from me. And am I going to lose my entitlements? That's how we got from Black Lives Matter to a response that all lives matter. Those are two statements that are not actually really in conversation. They're not saying the same thing, but they're based on this narrative that we got to make sure all the pie pieces are equal. We got to make sure, and as soon as you bring up rights and entitlements, I got to protect mine. And there's a limit to the effectiveness of that. But what if we as Christians can be people who are engaged in compassion, who see justice defined by compassion? It's not about how my pie piece compares to yours, but it's a matter of what do you need? And what do I have? That compassion, that trust in God's abundance, it changes the narrative, it changes the definition of justice. Because in the Old Testament, justice is compassion, it's generosity. And that's ultimately the only thing that's going to really bring reconciliation and justice in our world, is that we stop worrying about whether I'm giving you more than I get, and we start actually engaging with just what do people need for wholeness. And finally, only the congregation can actually be the faithful community of God's grace. Because you can only realize the community of God's grace in a community that is founded on God's grace. I think sometimes we think that the best we can do as Christians is to offer people the free version of the Christian app. Like, I want you to get all the benefits of being a Christian without actually submitting to Jesus. So I'm going to let you be blessed by being around Christians, and that'll be enough. And it is important that it is absolutely essential that we love our neighbors and love our community. But we have to offer more than that, because we don't actually have anything good that doesn't come from submitting to Jesus. We are not just the best politicians. We are not the smartest people. We're not the best doctors. What we have is the benefits of being in Christ. And so there's a slogan, a popular saying that says, be the change you want to see in the world. You know where that is in the Bible? It's not. That was Gandhi. Because here's the thing. If we are trying to be the change you can see in the world, then we are not being the change that Jesus created. Because the change that Jesus makes possible is not possible anywhere else. If the world can do it, it's not enough. We are supposed to be the change that cannot happen in the world. We are supposed to be communities founded on that generosity that people just can't do unless they trust that Jesus will provide enough. And that's why we need to recapture that focus on the congregation and what we as a community of believers can be. The way you treat each other on a Sunday morning, the way you take care of the people that are needy in your congregation throughout the week. When your congregation shows up at a widow's house and Rita's are siding, and the neighborhood sees you doing that. That is us being the community. And the goal then is to invite the whole world into that. It's not a focus on us versus them. It's a focus of us for them, because we don't want to just sprinkle God's love on people. I don't know about you. I'm from the Christian churches. We practice immersion. We baptize people in God's love. And that means we need to be the baptistry that can hold the water where you can dunk someone in it. That's what the church is. And ultimately, it is the church, it is the congregation that will endure when the kingdoms pass away. And so we need to be that community that we can invite people into where they can be immersed in the love of God. That is my understanding of the biblical vision, and it makes me excited to be a part of my congregation and a part of the church, and excited to be able to talk to you about this, because this means we have a productive vision. We don't have to just try and be neutral and weather political storms. We have a vision, we have a course, we have something we're doing, and it has been changing the world for 2,000 years, and it will continue to change the world until Jesus comes back. Amen.
All right. Well, we get to eat some real food now, and so you'll get to spend some time. We have sandwiches in the back. There's a variety of sandwiches. There is enough. There is enough. Yeah, that's good. Scarcity, plenty. And if there isn't enough, share even what is, right? And it will be multiplied. But yeah, on the boxes are written what the different variety of sandwiches are. There's chips, drinks in the cooler. We'll be back at 12:30, okay? So you can hang in here and eat. You can wander around, but we're going to begin again about 12:30, okay? Thanks.